When the light finally died, it didn't happen with a bang, but with a terrifying, muffled thud. The car crash took my vision, but it left behind a world that started sounding much louder than it ever had before. For the first 2 months, I existed in a fog of recovery, guided by the soft, reassuring hands of my wife, Elena. She was my anchor. She read my books, she guided me to the bathroom, she whispered words of comfort that felt like silk against my raw nerves. I truly believed I was a broken man, a fragment of the person I used to be. But slowly, the patterns began to shift. It started with the subtle scent of unfamiliar cologne lingering in the hallway, not mine, not the one I'd worn for years. Then, it was the sound of hushed, hurried conversations behind closed doors. My best friend, Marcus, who had been my right hand in the woodshop for a decade, started visiting daily. But he stopped talking to me about wood grains or antique restorations. He started talking about liquidating assets and long-term care. Every time they thought I was napping, the air in the room would shift with their movements, the soft rustle of expensive silk, the deliberate, cautious way they walked to avoid the floorboard I knew always creaked near the safe. My home, once a sanctuary of craftsmanship, was becoming a tomb of secrets, and I was the ghost trapped inside, listening to the echoes of my own erasure. I stopped being the man who waited for help. I became the man who mapped the dark. In the dead of night, I would literally crawl across the floor of my workshop, my fingertips tracing the familiar grain of oak and walnut, feeling for the missing tools. They were gone, my best chisels, the lathe blades, the brass fittings for the 18th century cabinet. I was restoring everything was disappearing piece by piece. Marcus was stripping me bare, and Elena was the one holding the door open for him. I remember the night I found the empty space on the display wall. I stood there, my hand hovering over the cold, hollow wood where my grandfather's custom mallet used to rest. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. Instead, I stood perfectly still, listening. From the living room, I heard the clink of ice against crystal, a sound of celebration. They were toasting to my incapacity. They were laughing, a low guttural sound of people who feel they have already won. They didn't understand that for a master woodworker, the workshop isn't just a place of business, it's a living, breathing extension of his nervous system. I knew every vibration, every resonance. When they moved my property, they weren't just taking objects, they were tearing away parts of me, and they had no idea that I was finally beginning to understand the blueprint of their betrayal. The most dangerous thing in this house wasn't the man who couldn't see. It was the man who stopped letting them know what he could hear. I began my counter-offensive. I acted erratic. I would talk to the furniture. I would pace the hallways at 3 a.m., muttering about lost designs and ghosts in the rafters. I intentionally left things out of place, then watched them squirm when I noticed it. I wanted them to think my mind was fracturing. Marcus grew bold. He started coming into the workshop while I was there, thinking I was just a blind man lost in his own memories. He'd gloat, he'd tell me about how the market had shifted, how my antique business was a dying relic. He wanted me to believe that I was irrelevant. Every time he spoke, I recorded the frequency of his voice, the cadence of his arrogance. I wasn't just observing him, I was dismantling him. I was building a cage for them, and they were so blinded by their own greed that they were busy carving the bars for me. They didn't realize that in my darkness, I had become the only person in the room who saw clearly. The plan needed a catalyst. I knew Marcus was planning to finalize the legal transfer of ownership on Friday. He had hired a sleazy attorney who wouldn't look too closely at the documents. I needed to be in the room, but I needed to be absent. I spent days preparing the house. I had learned how to tap into the old intercom system we had installed years ago, a feature Elena had completely forgotten about. I placed a hidden microphone inside the trophy cup Marcus loved to hold whenever he bragged. I knew his rhythm. I knew that when he got excited, he'd pace the kitchen floor in a specific pattern, always stopping by the wine rack. I prepared the environment, testing every floorboard, every angle. The house was no longer a home, it was a calibrated instrument. And I was the conductor. I felt the tension rising in them, the hurried whispers, the clinking of glasses, the nervous shifting of feet. They were approaching the crescendo. They thought they were closing a deal. In reality, they were walking into a vacuum I had created specifically for them. Friday arrived with the sound of rain hammering against the roof, a perfect cover for my final move. They sat at the kitchen table, the air thick with their greed. I heard the lawyer's voice, monotone and dry, reading the terms of my incompetence. Elena's voice was steady, almost cold, as she spoke about taking care of me. They were so smug, so confident. I stood in the workshop, my hand resting on the master breaker. I didn't rush. I waited until Marcus started bragging about the final payment. "It's all over," he chuckled. "He's finished." That was the moment. I slammed the breaker down. Total, absolute silence. Then, the sound of their panic, the scraping of chairs, the fumbling of feet in the dark, the sharp intake of breath. As reality struck them, the house was sealed. I didn't need eyes to navigate this darkness. It belonged to me. I stepped out of the workshop, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like the architect of their destruction. The game had finally begun.